Good afternoon. So thank you to all of those that are joining us here at the National Museum of Computing, and good afternoon to you that are on the Zoom link. So we're here with Sir Dermot Turing, and we've been working on kind of theories and myths of Alan Turing, and we would need to know the truth. Now, we decided that we'd look at a wide variety of kind of questions that we've gone out to the public to find out what's a myth, what's the truth. So I'm going to say to the guys that are on Zoom or on the live feed, if you have any questions, we've asked you to put into the chat, and we will try and get through to your questions at the end of this session. So Dermot, I have the first question I'd like to ask you. It's come through from a viewer or a follower on Twitter, and he has said, Dermot, what a privilege. Alan Turing is a massive personal hero, whom I voted for the £50 note. Huge highlight when he won. My question is, did he have any particular parts or bits of wisdom or a quotation which inspired him?
People quite often want to get hold of Alan Turing quotes. There's actually an industry at the minute of Alan Turing quotes. If you go to Amazon, so those of you watching on your computer will now no doubt go off and do this right now, you can type in Alan Turing inspiring quotes, and Amazon will then offer you a range of products which you can put in your office or on your desk or in your kitchen or wherever to be inspired by some marvellous thing that Alan Turing is supposedly to have said. I find it very curious that at least half of those quotes are made up.
Okay.
And I mean, he didn't write very prolifically when he was alive. He wrote a number of academic papers which these days would have ensured that he got fired from any university where producing several papers a year is absolutely necessary to hold down your job. In those days, things were a bit more relaxed. But he produced a remarkably small number of papers, and he produced a remarkably small number of writings which are of interest to the general reader. Most of his papers are written in mathematics, not in English. So, you know, you can't get quotes, well, for normal people anyway, you can't get quotes out of equations. So Einstein probably an exception to that one, because the only thing we can quote from Einstein is probably an equation. But Alan Turing was not that man. So there are a few things. So he gave a few radio broadcasts where we've got the transcripts, and he wrote a couple of popular papers, the most famous one being the one where he discusses the question whether machines can think, and it leads to that whole test called the Imitation game, where you shut a computer away in a room and you shut a person away in a room, and then the judge has to come and try and figure out which is the computer and which is the human. That paper has got some sort of quotable bits in it. But it seems to me that it's very odd indeed that the quotes that we associate with Alan Turing, particularly ones which you will find on Google from 2017 onwards, at least 50% of them were never uttered by Alan Turing. So then the question is, where have they come from? Where have the quotes come from? And the answer is in part that people have taken the script from the Imitation Game movie and kind of assumed that the scriptwriter was quoting, you know, from the horse's mouth, which is, you know, I mean, it only takes 10 seconds thought to realise that that's got to be nonsense. But half of them can't even be explained away in that way. So some of them are genuinely, completely and utterly made up, and I have no idea where they came from. So that wasn't quite what your question was asking, though. But
an inspirational
so the question was whether Alan Turing himself was inspired by any quote, and I don't think that. I think the answer to that is probably no. Though I think for every single thing that he did throughout the whole of his career, he was inspired by first of all, the people that he worked with. I mean, there's this myth of Alan Turing being this sort of solitary genius who worked in a cupboard all his life and never got out to speak to real people. And that's just nonsense. He was always surrounded by colleagues and sparking ideas off people and having arguments. That's kind of the way that most clever people work, actually. So I don't think he's particularly exceptional in that. But he would take the themes or the ideas that were coming from the conversations he was having and then push them out into some dimension that people hadn't thought of before. And that's where his real genius was. So constantly you can find, if you like, sort of seed corn in Alan Turing's history, where you can see, that's very interesting, because that idea seems to have blossomed into this. And so, for example, here we are, we're at the National Museum of Computing. We should celebrate the origins of computing, when Alan Turing invented computability in 1935, and he invented the concept of a multi-purpose computing machine. Now, people will say, well, sort of, so what? But back in 1935, machines only had one purpose. So the easiest way to visualize this is if you go into your kitchen and you've probably got a toaster, you've probably got a frying pan, you've probably got a dishwasher. I mean, you may not have all of those things, but if you do have them, then that's great. But if you tried to fry an egg in the dishwasher, it really wouldn't work. If you tried to cook a piece of toast in the dishwasher, it certainly wouldn't work. If you tried to wash dishes in the toaster, that would be a bit of a disaster. Single-purpose machines, particularly for doing what you might consider to be computation, was where it was at in the 1930s. So yes, there were adding machines, so people would have adding machines on their desks where you could crank a handle and it would do addition for you. But that machine would not be capable of being diverted into another purpose. So the idea that you could have a universal machine where you fed it different instructions so that it would carry out different tasks was an incredible breakthrough. And this whole thing came from a conversation that he was having at the back of a mathematics class at a university in Cambridge with his professor, who subsequently turned out to be a brilliant mathematician, came to Bletchley Park, solved the Lorentz problem, etc., etc. I mean, quite an amazing guy in his own right, Max Newman. Yeah. Newman said to Turing, he was explaining this idea about effectively the ground rules for mathematics, and whether you could have a sort of like a litmus test to see whether theorems were provable or not. This is the stuff that gets mathematicians going, okay? And so is there a litmus test to figure out whether theorems are provable or not? And so Newman was trying to get this concept across to his students and said, you can think of it this way, you can say, is there a process, a sort of a robotic, a mechanical process, where you could actually ask, could a machine do it, to figure out whether theorems are provable? Alan Turing takes away this idea that, can a machine do it? And he comes up with this concept of the computing machine that you could program to do different things. And it's quite extraordinary. And, we've now got an entire museum here devoted to the fallout from that one thought.
So the answer is, no, he didn't follow one particular inspirational quote, and he certainly didn't write any inspirational quotes.
Lots of people have written inspirational quotes in his name.
But what he has done, part of his legacy, is he has continued to inspire and infuse generations of people. That's, I think, the key message, isn't it, on that?
Yeah, your answer was a lot shorter and perhaps more user-friendly than mine. But yes, good.
So I am going to read this one question because from the same person, and the bonus question is, what was his favourite pastime other than running?
Okay, so the newspaper reports of Alan Turing's death have some rather strange things. So newspaper sub-editors are in a world of their own, and they have a sort of special form of creativity. So some of the things that they picked up on were did own cooking. Okay, so this is a man who died in 1954. So I guess the idea that a man who did his own cooking was possibly strange, but he lived on his own, so I'm not sure who else was going to do his cooking. But okay, so did own cooking. I mean, that probably doesn't count as a favourite pastime. Then another one, which also picks up the food theme, is there's a photograph of Alan Turing, and then it says underneath it says he fed the brain. Now you're thinking, what's going on here? Well, of course, the Manchester computer in 1954, this massive, great sort of computing machine in the style that we celebrate here with the working machinery from that era. And the Manchester computer was called, in popular speech, it was called the electronic brain. So Alan Turing was the man who fed the brain. Yeah. So did he feed the brain as a pastime? I'm not actually sure. Not actually sure that he did. There's a theory. There's a story that he took up playing the violin at one point. And anybody who's had small children who are learning the violin will know that for everybody else, people learning the violin is a sort of intensely unpleasant experience. So I'm slightly nervous about that. But no, the running is the main sort of extracurricular thing that he did. He liked to go down the pub. He liked to play chess. He wasn't particularly brilliant at chess. He wasn't lousy, and that got him into sort of a special league when he was at Bletchley Park, because Bletchley Park codebreakers divided into two groups as far as chess was concerned. There were the grandmasters. Bletchley Park was absolutely swarming with chess grandmasters. And then there were the lousy amateurs who couldn't play a game at all. And there were one or two people like Alan Turing who were sort of somewhere in the middle. They were no way grandmasters, but they could beat the amateurs. So it was sort of this tiny, a very small group of people who were sort of like half competent. And so he was in that group, and he was very keen. It was sort of like the holy grail for computer programming in the early 1950s. Could you write a program for a computer to play a game of chess? And so he actually came up with one of the world's first chess-playing algorithms. I have no idea whether it was any good, and I don't think it exists anymore. So it would be fascinating to discover that if it did. But so chess-playing, certainly. Let me think about other things. I mean, actually, what he really liked doing was just going down the pub and having a good old argument about the future of sort of science and, technology and that kind of stuff. So it sounds a bit like a busman's holiday, but there we go.
So I'm going to lead on with that. So we conducted a very small poll, and we wanted to know what people, all over the world knew or thought they knew about Alan Turing. And the percentage, out of 100%, there was 40% of people that believe that Alan Turing was just a codebreaker. But you've just mentioned a variety of other things: mathematician, an inventor, a scientist. In your expertise, tell us who you think Alan Turing really was.
Well, I'm sorry, 40% of your watchers on Zoom and 40% of the people in this room are either going to be deeply upset or they're going to leave, because I'm going to tell them all that Alan Turing was not much of a codebreaker. He was a mathematician hired by the codebreakers to assist them in their work. And that meant that, yes, they sent him on a codebreaking course because he had needed to know what it was that he was getting himself into. And certainly the influence that he had on the shape of code breaking in Britain was massive, but it was very short term. So let's just do a mini chronology around this. So Alan Turing is sent on a code breaking course because he knows nothing about the subject in January 1939. He is then detailed to work on the Enigma problem, but it's pretty half-hearted and it's part-time until war breaks out. He gets to Bletchley Park on the 4th of September 1939, day after Britain declares war. at that stage, he is working day and night on the Enigma problem because the Poles have come up with this marvellous truckload of information about how the Enigma machine works, which the British didn't really know anything much about until they gave it to them, and also their own code-breaking techniques. And that enables Alan Turing, together with various others I'll mention in a second, to come up with the design for the bomb machine, which is the famous machine that finds the settings that the Germans are using on their Enigma machines every day. The amazing thing that you've got the rebuild of here at the National Museum of Computing. That, again, just to sort of, while in passing, debunk another code-breaking myth about Alan Turing, which is that that machine was his own private creation and he cooked up in a garden shed somewhere. And it took many years of sweated labour to persuade the authorities that this was a sensible thing to do. It's all bunk. It's complete nonsense. They knew this was a number one problem, and they knew that the problem had to be solved using machinery, and they knew what the rough outline of the machinery was going to be because the Poles had already done it, and they'd given the British the template for how to follow that particular path. What Alan Turing needed to do was to build a much more versatile, more sort of souped up version of what the Poles had done, which would be much more future-proof. And so that was the task that he was put on. He'd created his design by, according to documents in the National Archives, he'd done that by the end of the month, by the end of the first month of the war. So you're then wondering what Alan Turing then did from the end of September 1939 right to VE Day. We'll come on to that in a second. But he then didn't build the bomb machine because he was a lousy engineer. So he hired, the Bletchley Park management hired the British tabulating machine company that made early computing machines. They made punch card tabulators and that kind of stuff. They made pre-war computing machinery. These were the people who were there to turn it into engineering reality. And then when the prototype finally arrived at Bletchley Park in early 1940, it didn't work very well. And it took the genius of another mathematician called Gordon Welshman to basically add a modification to it that made it work effectively. So I haven't got Alan Turing doing any code breaking yet. I've got him doing some engineering design, some circuitry design, some logic design. It's very, very clever. I don't try and disparage his work or his inventiveness, but this isn't real code breaking. He then did turn his attention to naval Enigma, which was a much more difficult problem and involved much more of what code breakers would recognise to be code breaking, which is figuring out what the system is and then trying to figure out a way of breaking it. And so he did that for a couple of years, but it wanes. By the time you get to 1942, Enigma code breaking has become mechanised because his machine works quite well. There's plenty of bright minds who are probably more adept at code breaking than he is around to do stuff, so they find other things for him to do. They send him off site. He's not actually at Bletchley Park. After the summer of 1942, he was in America for 6 months, and then when he comes back, he's sent to Hanslope Park, which is like these days I'll probably get into trouble for saying this. It's still a secret government establishment at Hanslope Park, and the rumours that you read in the newspapers, if they're to be believed, then this is where the latter-day Q division that provides the sort of James Bond devices that our spies need in foreign parts. And they do other stuff as well. So he was sent off there to do basically cybersecurity work, which was interesting. So, I haven't answered your question yet. If Alan Turing wasn't a code breaker, what on earth was he? So the 60% who didn't think he was a code breaker, now you can leave the room because you'll be all very, very bored. In his lifetime, he was celebrated as this pioneer of computer science, the person who had been responsible for the design of Britain's computer, singular, because in 1945, the people in power knew that we only needed one. I mean, what would you use computers for? I mean, in 1945 it was obvious. You used them to calculate the trajectories of missiles, and it's complicated. I mean, if you think that you've got an anti-aircraft missile, and it's complicated because the aircraft is moving at possibly variable speed. The missile is going to sort of follow a particular path, and that's affected by wind speed and the density of the air, so things like humidity and the spin as it comes out of the barrel, and muzzle velocity and all those kinds of things. Lots and lots of variables, and some of them are interdependent. So the amount of friction that the missile has on going through the air depends on the speed, and so you've got complicated feedback equations going on here. So very complicated equations. So you'd need a computer for that. But if you tot up the number of trajectory equations you're going to have to solve in any given month, you probably only need one computer. So we only needed one computer. So Alan Turing then spends the next 3 or 4 years trying to convince the powers that be that computers are for things other than calculating missile trajectories. He says, there's this guy called Sir Edward Travis. I can't tell you what he did or does. He happens to be now the head of GCHQ in 1945. He says, but if you ask him, he might be able to give you a bit of a clue that there are some other things you can get computers to do. And then he comes up with another long list of stuff that you can get computers to do. So that's what he was famous for in his lifetime. But I think he was also famous for having written this paper on that we were talking about earlier on computable numbers, and this was in the world of mathematical logic. It wasn't really intended to be a paper about computer science at all until suddenly that's what people breathed life into it through that process we've just been talking about. But so mathematical logic, foundations of computer science, foundations of an entire discipline of mathematics which is about computability. We have entire maths departments in universities that study this subject. A little bit of code breaking as an interlude, and then we've got computer design, and then computer programming, which was fiendishly difficult in the 1950s. And finally, towards the end of his life, what feels like a bit of a departure, and I don't really understand why people aren't switched on by this quite as much as you'd expect, but he was looking at how patterns form in plants and animals. And he was able to model things like zebra stripes, leopard spots. There's this weird sort of maze-like patterns that you see on pufferfish that are found in the Congo River. And these patterns can be explained by the equations that he came up with. And I love this stuff because it's very visual and it's brightly coloured, and you can show pictures of it, which is cool. And then he was also looking at the same kind of problems in plants. So the problem he'd only got halfway through at the end of his life was why, if you look at the, I don't know what you call them, the sort of spine things that you find on a fir cone, that they're arranged in spirals, and some of them go one way around the fir cone and some of them go the other way. Sort of left-handed and right-handed directions. And if you count the spirals, it's difficult. You thought that counting was difficult. Counting can be really hard, particularly when it comes to biology, but count the spirals, and you'll find that the ones going one way and the ones going the opposite way are adjacent numbers in a Fibonacci series. Same thing. You go down to Waitrose at Christmas time, or Marks and Spencer's,
and other
or other supermarkets. We are not plugging any particular brand here, but you will find that they serve these they sell these big long stalks which have got sprouts on them. They haven't chopped the sprouts off and put them in a plastic bag. They're just still stuck to the stalk. Again, the sprouts are arranged around the stalk in spirals. And again, it's the same thing. There's a different number of spirals. Some of the spirals go to the left and some of them go to the right. And you'll find that if you count the spirals, they're a bit easier to do with sprouts and fir cones, actually. But again, it's adjacent numbers of the Fibonacci series. Same thing with sunflowers. You can count the sunflower seeds in the sunflower head are arranged in a spiral pattern. Some going to the left, some going to the right, adjacent numbers in the Fibonacci series. and he was trying to make his theory of pattern formation explain pattern formation like that in plants, in the same way that he'd been able to explain it in animals. So is this guy a codebreaker? I don't think so. I think he's just a whizzy biologist. But,
So we can now 100% say that if you think that Alan Turing was just a codebreaker, you are very, very wrong.
I wouldn't want to take that away, because I think I've come back to what I said earlier, that he had this astonishing influence on codebreaking. And one thing I didn't mention was that as a mathematician informing the shape of codebreaking in the 1940s, he forced the mathematicians to confront something that they had been denying for a while, which was that their approach to probability and statistics was too dogmatic, and they've been ignoring this theory, which we now use all the time, and in the middle of the pandemic we're using it to try and explain what might happen in the future. We're using Bayesian statistics, the probability that such and such is the case given that something else that we know is or might be the case. And that was very, it was almost heretical to think about statistics in that way in the 1930s, because Professor Fisher at Cambridge University said that he wasn't going to allow anybody to practice in his university if they believed in such nonsense. And so Alan Turing actually basically forced the statisticians at Bletchley Park to think about probability in this Bayesian way instead of the old-fashioned way, and that meant that they could make much better predictions about, just sort of everyday things like, well, everyday for codebreakers, things like which rotor are the Germans using in the right-hand position in the Enigma machine today. We don't have any data on that, but we can probably predict it using these kinds of statistical techniques, which are considered to be, I don't know, some violation of statistical religion, which was, it was really interesting. So he stamped that on the codebreaker. So we mustn't write him out of the codebreaking story. I don't seek to do that, but
there was so much more,
yeah.
And actually, a lot of us, or most people on the planet, are actually benefiting from the things that he started, established, and created, or were inspired by. So I think, yeah, this is a short answer, okay? On another poll, we asked representatives, anyone that's sort of following, or anyone's got an interest in Alan Turing, give us, one sentence, one word that you think is part of Alan Turing's legacy. And I have to say, there was a huge percentage, and accessibility came into it. Now, these were very one-worded, but I found that it really hit home to me, because actually I do think that he is he was a fantastic advocate of what we're trying to do now. We are behind the times in regards to being accessible when it comes to computing and technology, whether it's girls, boys, neurodiverse communities. I know that you have a passion for getting the younger generations into this, but I want you to elaborate on the fact that I'm saying accessibility, but you can explain that better, I think, of his legacy of what we're doing, or what we can or should be doing.
Okay, so what I am perhaps I think is a sort of 20th century view of Alan Turing is to look at him as a historical figure who did all these amazing things, and that's not wrong. I don't sort of seek to tear that up and throw it away, but there's a reason that he's on the £50 note, and the reason he's on the £50 note is not purely as a historical figure of interest. I think he's on the £50 note because the Bank of England and the committee of folks that selected Alan Turing from a wide field of very brilliant stars, frankly, they're trying to convey a message which is about the future. And yes, all right, to pick a character who in his lifetime was finding that he couldn't get his papers published because they accused him of writing science fiction. That's a cool guy to pick to be an inspirational figure for the future. And I think you're absolutely right. They've picked him because in part he's a figure that represents diversity. And okay, we know that there's this story about him being, prosecuted because he was gay and of being therefore a victim of sort of the purge against gay men in the early 1950s. That's not how he would ever have wanted to be remembered. But I think what we can do is sort of convert that, because Alan Turing's become some sort of icon anyway. He can stand for a bunch of ideas and, if you like, an agenda of things that we ought to do. And yes, it's got to be connected with who he was and what he did and what he stood for in his own lifetime, otherwise it's totally artificial. But certainly during his lifetime he was, I think, an enthusiast for promoting how exciting and interesting mathematics and science could be. I mean, when he was a kid, so he's like 17, okay, in his boarding house at school, there's this extraordinary building with this, for a school building it is extraordinary, there's this sort of like quite elegant iron staircase that wraps itself around four corners of the sort of stairwell. And the centre of it is hollow, so the stairs actually just sort of stick out from the walls. Well, obviously there's a safety rail, but it means that you've got this sort of hollow square in the middle, and it's a 3-storey building. So you can pin something to the ceiling at the top, and it will hang all the way down to the bottom. So Alan Turing hung a pendulum all the way down, and you start this thing swinging, and this was a Foucault's pendulum, and as it swings, provided you've fixed it with a point at the top, as it swings, it will go round in the plane in which the pendulum swings will rotate, reflecting the rotation of the Earth, and you can tell whether you're in the northern or southern hemisphere from which direction it goes round. And this is like kind of cool stuff. This is somebody who's 17 who's just doing this, and the other kids at school are thinking, whoa, what's going on here? You know, I mean, and this is, it's all part of his sort of willingness to infuse people in the stuff that he finds really sort of sexy and exciting. And so I think that, yes, therefore, we should use his example to inspire people to find that sort of spark of interest in areas where, frankly, our own school report as a society should be marked needs to do a lot better. Let me give you some examples. I only learnt this year, but we have as a society known it for over 10 years. That of the people coming up for higher education or careers in computer science, only 16% are women. What's happened to the other women who wanted to do computer science? Society, and I don't blame schools, incidentally, I really don't blame schools, because I talk to school teachers about this problem all the time, and they are as dismayed by it as I am. So it's something that's happening in society where somebody is saying to young girls quite early in their lives that these are boys' subjects, or they're too difficult, or that because they're a creative person, then they should go off and do something else. And it's just nonsense. We're depriving ourselves of really talented computer scientists because we're being genderized about it. Let me give you another example. And this one really annoys me. And I know it's not right to put all black and ethnic minority people into the same bucket. Mm-hmm. So I'll pull out of that bucket one particular subgroup, which is kids who self-identify as being black Caribbean for their ethnicity. Yeah. Those kids don't present for STEM subjects at A-level. Disproportionately, they are somehow pushed off into other things. I'm not saying they don't do A-levels, I'm just saying they're disproportionately not put forward for science and technology and mathematics at A level. Again, that's society that's doing that. Somebody has said to them at some point on the way, oh, but chemistry is a difficult subject and you might find it a bit of an easier win to do something else. Mm-hmm. And these kids, you know, who might be brilliant chemists and they might be really excited by the subject, are somehow being put off. And, you know, we've got to fight against that. We've got to stop talking about it and actually start doing something about it.
Very good. I knew you were passionate about that one. So I'm going to ask, we've talked about some of his achievements, and I think that could take years to really talk. And actually, I think as we're evolving within technology, science, you know, mathematics, his achievements are constantly evolving because, you know, he started these sort of these things, and we're evolving on his concepts and his theories. So actually, you know, forever more he's going to be in existence, and hopefully we continue to grow that. We briefly touched on the £50 note. In brief, tell me why you really think that he's on the £50 note. Your opinion.
Yeah, well, I've talked to the folks at the Bank of England about their selection process, which I think is about as fair as you could ask for. They asked the public to nominate people. They said £50 note's got to have a scientist on it because we cover other areas of life on the other denominations. And we also want to find a character who can represent diversity. And if you look at the shortlist, it was really eye-wateringly difficult for them to make their decision. I think, give you the honest answer to your question, I am sure that the fact that Alan Turing was nominated by BBC Two viewers as the nation's icon of the 20th century, I think that will have had a powerful impact. I think the Imitation Game movie will have had a powerful impact, drawing the attention of the public to this obscure person that they wouldn't have heard of before. And that's all partly driven, I think, by his own tragic life story. So you've got somebody who was a super achiever and we're sort of fond of in terms of the sort of the nation's heart, but I think it's also the heartstrings are sort of twanged a little bit by that sort of personal tragedy. And I think that's, you put all those things together in the mix, and I think that's the reason why they picked him. You asked me to be brief, but can I just add one footnote to that, which is about this thing about being an icon. I find this whole thing very strange, and we began with fake quotes, but I think one of the sort of side effects of the disease called being an icon is that you get all kinds of mythology and weirdnesses sort of like poured into the vessel that is called the icon that was Alan Turing. And what's in that vessel is no longer the person that was alive between 1912 and 1954. It's some product of our own modern imagination, and it's, I mean, that in itself is fascinating, that whole sort of process of turning somebody into something that they weren't. I mean, that's very, very interesting to me, but I think when we're thinking about Alan Turing, I think we need to constantly remind ourselves, are we talking about Alan Turing the icon, or are we talking about Alan Turing the person? And, you know, I'm not saying that it's wrong to think of him as an icon. I'm not very keen on sort of these kinds of judgments anyway, but what are we trying to get out of it? And if we can get away from this sort of slightly sentimental notion of him as being this sort of codebreaker who won the war for us, and this victim of state persecution, both of which are pieces of mythology, then that would be really good.
So you touched on this. Imitation Game, we asked the question, do people think that it was factually correct? Do they think it's terribly incorrect? And the main, or would you like to know more? Or are they unsure? all seen, I've personally seen a very large document with what is stated as inaccuracies on the story. And I'm being polite. It was handed to me, and actually I did actually enjoy the read, because watching the film, you know, there is an icon, Alan Turing. Oh my God, he's in the movie. That's great. This is, you know, can you just tell us just what?
Well, I'd be very interested to know how many people thought it was accurate, because
20% of the poll said that they thought that it was as accurate as possible. 80% were. It was very much sold for Hollywood.
Well,
it was
of course it's it's Hollywood, and I suspect that any biopic that comes out of Hollywood is going to have to be remoulded to tell a good story and to sell plenty of cinema tickets, and that's their job. And did they do a good job? Yeah, I think they did a cracking job, actually. And anybody who's grumpy about the movie is probably forgotten that they're going to the movies which are designed to entertain you, and they should probably have watched a documentary on the History Channel. You know, I mean, and you know, there's horses for courses here. So Hollywood shouldn't be blamed for producing, I think, a really good movie. I'm delighted they produced a good movie. And I'll tell you one of the other great things about that movie, quite apart from the fact that it's put Alan Turing on the map in a way that he probably wasn't before, it's actually prompted a load of people who didn't really know anything or anything significant about it to find out about things like World War II code breaking or the history of early computers, and so that's been a great boost to those of us who are in the sort of world of computing heritage. So it's a nice sort of spin-off for us. But does it matter that it's inaccurate? I don't think it does, provided that people remind themselves that they were watching a movie. But to come back to the point about icons, I think that's really hard to ask people to do that. If the first encounter that you come across with somebody like Winston Churchill was in the movies, you will think of Winston Churchill's habits as being as played by the actor that you saw, and you will think of Winston Churchill's utterances as being the things that you heard in that movie. And yeah, there's probably enough movies about Winston Churchill for, after a while, that to become moderated and sort of just changed into something that's probably a bit closer to what he was like in real life. With Alan Turing, that's not going to happen, and so Alan Turing has now become the character that was written in that script, which is not Alan Turing. I mean, there's this victimization, victimhood narrative that runs from the very first scene right through to the end of the movie, and it's all, I mean, it's a dramatic construct. There's no factual basis for it. So we have to just sort of constantly remind ourselves that the movie is not the biography. If you want the biography, go read the biography.
I have to just make one point on this though. So we want to inspire future generations, and we really, especially here at the museum, want to ensure that the next generation or those that want to learn get the factual information. But Alan Turing maybe wasn't as well recognised or acknowledged for being a computer scientist and all those other things until they watched the film. So they watched the film, and then that's what they believe is true. So it's very hard because
But does it matter? I mean, to be honest, I think it probably doesn't matter unless people are trying to make some kind of sentimental point about Alan Turing's own life, which is based on the movie. I mean, I'm delighted that people should take the movie and be inspired by it and want to, use that as a springboard for doing something, whether it be to come here and see the bomb machine, in operation, or whether it's to go off and convince the world that we need more than one computer. That's a cracking thing. When it gets to, I suppose that what I'm really telling you is that lots of people ask me questions which tends to use the imitation game narrative as their starting point, like, how do you feel about Alan Turing's terrible mental illness towards the end of his life? And I was saying, well, there is no evidence that he was mentally ill towards the end of his life, so I'm not sure how I can have feelings about it. But I guess other people don't get asked questions like that, so it doesn't really matter too much. So yes, let's stick to the positive and the inspiration and and perhaps sort of not worry too much about what sort of being an icon actually means.
And the achievements.
The achievements are really important because the achievements, I think, are the source of the inspiration.
Yeah. Would you say that in hindsight, do you think that Alan Turing was a free spirit and was allowed to being at Bletchley Park, you were here to do a job. So, as you say, he went on to the training courses, and he did what he needed to do. He did that very quickly and moved on to the next thing. Do you think that there may have been bigger and better things to come from him if he hadn't have started here?
Oh, that's a very interesting thought. I think that being at Bletchley Park put him in contact with a group of people who he probably wouldn't have come across in his field of mathematical logic, where he was active before the war began. Ranging from, I'll give you just two examples out of many characters that he met at Bletchley Park. One person that, and those of you who've watched the Imitation game will know this well, that he met and got very fond of this very brilliant Cambridge mathematician called Joan Clark, and they were briefly engaged to be married for a time. And I think that this widened his world because historically he'd been in basically all male institutions all his life, right up to sort of the age of 28 or whatever he was when he came to Bletchley Park. And I think to discover that women were not some kind of fairy creature that perhaps his mother had been to him, and could engage in intellectual battle about problems that fascinated him. I think that was very important, and I think it's quite interesting that if you look at his research students at Manchester, he supervised a remarkably small number of people for higher degrees, but his research students, he had 3 at Manchester, 2 of whom were women. And while this was going on, he was engaged in correspondence with one of the research students who was doing her thesis for Professor Maurice Wilkes, who's very closely associated with this museum that we're in. Maurice's student was called Beatrice Worsley. She was Canadian, and it's quite interesting because Alan Turing and Beatrice Worsley are conducting a transatlantic correspondence about her thesis, and it's full of backchat about Alan Turing's and Maurice Wilkes's mutual antipathy. So it's actually quite amusing. So he's having this sort of really quite open, irreverent correspondence with this woman student who he's not supervising, but he's sort of like advising on the periphery of her thesis. She's probably incidentally the first person in the world to have got a PhD in computer science. She just happens to be a woman, So I think this is, there's lots of sort of subtext to this particular plot. But so I think Alan Turing's sort of like ability to deal with women on their own terms and as equals, I think that probably started here at Bletchley. The other person I'd like to mention is Donald Mickey. Donald Mickey became the Professor of Machine Intelligence at Edinburgh University, and he started out doing something completely different, and then he came to Bletchley Park and was put on the team who were designing and building the Colossus machine and solving the Lorentz problem. And although Alan Turing wasn't working physically at Bletchley Park, he would drop in from time to time because he was on the machine committee. And so he'd like to find out what was happening on the Colossus project and so forth. And then he'd go off to the pub with Donald Mickey, and they discuss this big problem we were talking about earlier, which is whether you could program a computer. Bearing in mind that all they had was a half-built Colossus. So whether you could program a theoretically possible future computer, whether you could program a computer to play a game of chess. In other words, could you design an algorithm? How could you actually break down the steps that the computer would need to take into small enough units to constitute a set of instructions for the computer as to what to do when playing a game of chess? I'd do this in the pub over beer. I mean, okay, most people go to the pub to watch the football, but these guys, they went off to do this. And I think that's lovely, because this means that Mickey is inspired by these conversations and by what he's doing here at Bletchley Park on Colossus. He changes the direction of his career completely to go off and become what may have been the first professorship of artificial intelligence in the UK. And this is all inspired by this sort of whole Turingism, which I think is, I mean, it's just a lovely story. There's a footnote to it, which I must, if you will permit me, it'll take 1 minute. Just permit me. In 1940, everybody knew, it wasn't a speculation, everybody knew for a factual certainty that the Germans were going to invade Britain. It was just a matter of when, not whether. So everybody was doing civil defence, and everybody was terrified about what it was going to be like. So Alan Turing took all his savings out of the bank and converted them into silver bars, because he reckoned that once the Germans invaded them, the banks will all go bankrupt, never get your money out. So the sensible thing to do was to convert it into real assets that would retain their value. He went out into the countryside with a pram that he'd borrowed from somebody, put the silver ingots in the pram so he didn't have to carry them because they were heavy, and he buried them in a field. And he made a careful map showing where in the field he'd, go to the third oak tree, turn left, measure exactly 90 degrees from that oak tree, however many paces there. 1945, Donald, Mickey and Alan Turing borrow a pram, go back to the field with Alan's homemade metal detector. You can feel what's going to happen now. You can already see the punchline, can't you? They dug, and they didn't find the silver ingots. My father saying, they're well on their way to Australia by now. But and so, of course, it's Don and Mickey that we have to know the story about this buried silver ingots and how they were never found.
Ever, to this day?
No, so somebody within, let's say, 15 miles of Bletchley is sitting on a fortune.
Oh, you definitely heard that one here first.
But yeah, don't come dig up bits of the National Museum of Computing, because I'm fairly sure that it's not on the Bletchley Park site.
No, absolutely not. Does anyone here have a question for Dermot? No inspiring questions.
I could ask something. I've always thought the thing that Turing did for code breaking was the bomb, whereas the Poles had always attacked the introduction bit, the setting up stuff. And what Turing did was to say, go for the message, which the Germans can't change. They can't do anything about that. Message is a message.
Yes, so
so it's innovative.
You're absolutely right. So this is where we shouldn't disparage the inventiveness of Alan Turing in terms of the Enigma problem, but the way that the problem had evolved by the time it was presented to him was that the Poles had solved the problem of how the Enigma machine was being set up, given the way that the Germans were using the machine in 1939. And this depended on them, forgive me, this is going to be slightly technical and it will take about 3 minutes, but we'll do our best to get it done that way. So if I'm a German Enigma operator, I need to tell the person who's going to receive my message how to orientate the 3 coding rotors in their machine so that they're set up the same way for decryption as I am using them for encryption. So the question is, what are the 3 letters that are uppermost on those 3 rotors? I need to tell the other guy that information. I'm not going to broadcast it because there's some rotter, some British person is listening in to the message. So I'm not going to broadcast it in clear, I'm going to encipher it. So what I'll do is I'll set my Enigma rotors to some random 3 things, and then I will encipher those 3 letters that I've secretly chosen as the starting point for the real message. And then here's where the Germans were doing this weird thing up to May 1940. They would encipher these 3 letters, which are the starting positions of the rotors, twice over. And it was because they did it twice that it gave the Poles an opportunity to figure out what that setting was, because they could see patterns forming in the way that the enciphered versions of those 3 letters repeated manifested itself. And everybody knew, including the Germans, by the way, who'd been bleating that this was their own code people had been bleating this was an insecure practice. Everybody knew that the Germans sooner or later would figure out that it wasn't secure and would change it. So they'd only encipher it once, and then that would blow the Polish technique completely out of the water. But what the Poles had done is they'd shown the way that by mechanising the process of just testing all 17,500 odd possible rotor positions and doing that electromechanically, you could just go for lunch while the machine just cranks through laboriously all the possibilities, that provided the basis for a logic test as to whether you got the right setting or not. What Alan Turing had to do was to invent a new technique which didn't depend on this double encipherment of the starting point, but was dependent, as your question said, on the content of the message. So you would guess that the Germans had put some stock phrase into their messages, and actually the military are terribly good at creating stock phrases. I mean, the military will typically, any French military report, you get hounded out of the French army if you did not begin your report with "I have the honour to report." So that gives you an absolutely perfect thing. So you know, j'ai l'honneur. You could just type in "honneur" and it would just. And the Germans were a bit like this too. So their reports were very stereotyped, and the way that they'd express themselves lent itself to particular words and phrases coming out all the time. And so you would say, "I'll bet you that somewhere in this message there's this particular word or phrase," and so you could look for it. And so instead of relying on the 3 letter settings at the beginning, this sort of piece of metadata, you'd actually test for the content. But it was the same idea. You go through all the 17,000 odd settings and then you test to see whether one of them is logically plausible for the way that the Germans have set their thing up. So he took this Polish idea of mechanically going through everything, brute force test, coupling it with his new logic test, and putting the two things together.
Thank you. I have a question from Mick, and he has said, "I've heard rumours that Turing made several unauthorised trips to Czechoslovakia or other Eastern European countries. Is this true?"
Never heard it before. I think it's highly unlikely. He certainly went to Germany before World War II on, I think, more than one occasion. He went to the United States on several occasions, including a secret trip during the middle of World War II, which he wouldn't tell anybody about after the war had finished, because the information he'd been given by the Americans was still so highly classified that it would be extremely dangerous to talk about it. So he didn't even mention that he'd actually been to the country at all. But no, I'm not aware of any trips to Central Europe.
Okay. Another question that's just come through. Why was Delilah not taken up by the post office?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. So,
bearing in mind, I know we're nearly out of time. I'm really sorry, but
okay. So I will be very quick. Delilah was a machine invented by Alan Turing to encipher phone calls. So you think about Enigma as enciphering written messages. How can you encipher a phone call? Got all sorts of problems because you've got to have decipherment in real time, whereas written messages, you can do it after breakfast. Delilah was Alan Turing's answer to this, and it was a machine that was about the size of a typewriter, a bit bigger, and it was ready for production by about D-Day, and it was never picked up because I think the Americans got their speech encipherment machine developed faster, even though it was very much bigger. I mean, we're in a room at the National Museum of Computing which you use as a classroom, and it's about, the American machine would have taken up 2/3 of this room. So not exactly portable. But I think that it was because they got theirs to market first, and because by D-Day, even if the machine's ready to go into production by D-Day, that doesn't mean that the machines will actually be ready in time for battle use. And everybody expected, particularly in the second half of 1944, that actually the war would probably be over by Christmas 1944 in Europe. So I think that they just didn't bother to put it into production.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to say thank you, but I am going to do a bit of a very cheeky plug. I'm very sorry, everyone. So
I'm not sorry.
Today I was given this. So this is, written by this fine gentleman just here. Reflections of Alan Turing. You have 1 minute to tell us what this is, what it's going to give us.
Well, okay, so this is stimulated by the £50 note and the idea of Alan Turing becoming an icon. And I thought probably what I should do is look at some of the themes and ideas that you can be inspired about, not just from Alan Turing's own life and his achievements and some of the mythology that's built up around him, but some of the things that are in his background, which might, so for example, there's a fascinating story in there about his female cousins who became radiologists in the 1890s, and we didn't know. I mean, there's a marvellous photo in there of my ancestor, Alan's ancestor, called Edith Stoney, teaching physics to women medical students in London in 1913, before World War I. That's something that we didn't imagine was possible, let alone actually happening. So there's some really quite interesting stuff in there, and it's all in Alan Turing's background, and then you can take away from that what you think might be an inspiring story for you from around that.
So we can say that if you purchase this book online, it will be available at TNMoC. It's factually correct?
Apart from the mistakes that I've made, but those are not deliberate. But,
very good.
But yes, so buy it for TNMoC, because it would be nice for you guys to get the
reward.
Get the reward.
Yeah.
Yes.
On behalf of the museum and everyone else, I'd like to say thank you very much.
Well, thank you for having me.
And everybody that's online, I'd like to say thank you. Thanks for joining us. If you have any questions that we haven't answered, please do email us at the museum, and I'm sure that Dermot and I will catch up, and we can maybe do another blog or another interview where we can answer all of those questions that you do have. And have a lovely weekend.